G'day everyone, I'm going to show you how to have a bit of a play with some clay. But before we start, I thought I'd just tell you what clay is. So clay comes from the ground in the form of decomposed rocks, where it travels by rivers and settles in an area until it's collected. It's made up of water, silica and alumina, and it's called wet clay at this point, and this is what you use to create your pieces of work. Now, what can you use your clay for? You can use it to make cups and bowls and plates, and that's a very practical thing, so a usable thing that you can use it for. Or you can make it decorative, so that's your sculptures and your figurines or your bit of jewelry or just something decorative. Now, when you have created your piece, it's still quite wet. After it dries for a little bit, it's called leather hard. Now, you still have to be careful with it, because if you actually put it out in the rain, it would go back to its wet substance. But while it's leather hard, it's great for you to carve bits and pieces into and put decoration on as well. Once it's dry, it's called greenware clay or bone dry clay, and that means all the moisture has been taken out of it and it's ready to be fired. So when you fire a piece of clay, you put it in a kiln. There's other ways you can fire clay, but here at my school I have a kiln, and I'm fortunate enough to have that. And once you've gone through and fire it for the first time, it's called a bisque fire, and that keeps its shape. It's still porous, so the water still goes through it. If you don't want it to be porous, you can give it a second firing, but you need to add a glaze, and it's like a sealant. Just make sure you don't put any glaze on the bottom of your clay, because it will stick to your kiln and it'll just sort of erode it. Now, for a start, I have a earthenware clay. So this is a white clay, and I've bought it from a company called Art. So they've purchased it as well, and then it sat in my storeroom for a while. And I went to a ceramics course the other day, and they were saying the best way to get started on wedging your clay is to drop the bag of clay on the ground several times. So it's a little bit heavy, but it works. It seems to mix it up a little bit nicer than before I start hand wedging it. So I'm going to drop the clay, and I'm going to pick it up again, and again. So it's not very exciting, but it works. So I've just opened my bag of clay, and as soon as you start to open it to the air, it will start to dry out. So once you've used it, you make sure the bag is put back on it, or you put it in a plastic bag, and I usually get students to try and bring in plastic bags. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a chunk of clay off. I've bought this, it's a little piece of wire with two little pieces of wood at the end, but if you have fishing line, it does exactly the same thing. It's nice and easy to trim. You just pull back. How cool is that? The students love it. Okay, so I'm going to show you a process of hand wedging. Now, how I set up my room is I have a bit of lino, and it doesn't really matter what side, but I tend to use the back side. And I just went to a second-hand place and ordered some lino, and then I just cut it up. So I lay this across the table. So I have about 9 or 10 sheets of this. And once I'm finished, I actually put it out, I dry it separately, because if you put it together, it'll get moldy. I have just a container, and I bought some tools, and I also have the knives and forks in here, because that's just as good as some of the tools. Straws handy for some decoration. Skewers are handy for bits and pieces as well. Now, the thing about doing your ceramics is, once you have bought some of this stuff, the only thing you really need to do is buy the clay, and the clay is about, where I buy it from a company called Art, is about, I don't know, $10 to $12, I think it is. So it's actually not that expensive, and 2 bags, I can get a whole 24 kids to make something. So in relations to hand wedging, so this is my piece of clay. It's like rolling dough. So I'm going to just put it in a bit of a shape to get it started, and then I'm going to squash a little bit down, take some from the back, squash a little bit more down, and take some from the back. Now you notice that I actually do stand up when I do this, because I find I need the weight of my body to push the clay forward. And then you'll notice as well that what I'm doing is I'm mixing the clay, I'm creating the layers. So it is actually for a couple of reasons. It mixes the clay together. It also helps to get rid of air bubbles, and it makes it a nice consistency. The thing about your clay as well is it actually has a memory. So if I had torn my clay and then put that back together, it actually has a memory, so it will remember that. So when you're making something out of the clay, it doesn't really like to have that memory. So again, I would put that together, and then I'm going to hand wedge by grabbing from the back, bringing it forward again and again. So one of the questions would be is how long do you hand wedge your clay for? If you leave it in the class, get the kids to do it for too long, the clay will actually start to dry out, and then it's too hard for them to handle. If you have a look at my hands, you can see that there's a part of my hands that has moisture on it now. So that's because my hands are absorbing the moisture from the clay. So I'm going to do it for a couple of minutes. It gives the students an idea of how to hand wedge, and then they can start their pieces. Another way to wedge your clay is by using your cutting tool. So I cut it through, I flip it over, and I slam it back down. Now the thing with doing this in a class of 24 is it gets so noisy, and then they just slap it silly. So if you have a class that can manage it, or if they're doing it properly, this is a nice way to hand wedge your clay. Now I was just looking to see if there's a little air bubble in there to show you, but there's not. So you do this quite a bit, and then depending on what I'm making, I might tear some of that off. Now again, I said the clay has a memory, so it actually doesn't like those lines. Now when you can see I'm actually using both my hands to do this, because I find if I'm using my clay and I just use one hand, by the time I've made a heap of these, my hand gets full. So I use both hands. Now you can see it still has a little bit of a memory, so I work the clay until that's all gone. And there we have hand wedged